Noon in a dry valley, and the ground under one tree is bare dirt. Step across the shade line, and the grass returns instantly, as if the tree drew a border no seed dares cross. This is a eucalyptus, and foresters have a plain name for that empty ring, the bare zone. For decades, the explanation was simple. The tree is thirsty and greedy for light, so it starves whatever tries to grow beneath it. Then investigators collected the rainwater dripping off its leaves and poured it on fresh seed, and the seed refused to sprout. Not the shade, not the drought. The water off the leaves alone stopped it. So the tree is not merely hoarding sun and water. It is putting something into that ground on purpose. Walk any grove of them, in Australia, in California, in Portugal, and you find the same swept circle, curling leaves, strips of shed bark, and almost nothing green pushing through. What a eucalyptus actually spins to hold that bare ring is stranger than starvation, and the field spent 40 years arguing over it. By the end, you will know exactly what is in those fallen leaves, and why a tree would poison its own doorstep. The clearest early report did not come from Australia at all. It came from California, where eucalyptus was never native. In the early 1900s, settlers planted millions of them, mostly the river red gum, Eucalyptus camaldulensis, as fast-growing windbreaks and timber. The trees thrived, but farmers and botanists kept noticing the same thing. Under the older groves, the ground was strangely clean. Native grasses and wildflowers that carpeted the open hills stopped dead at the edge of the canopy. In the late 1960s, two plant ecologists at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Cornelius Muller and his colleague Roger Del Moral, decided to treat it as a measurable problem rather than a curiosity. They mapped the bare zones by hand. They collected the fog and dew that condensed on the leaves and ran off the bark. They caught the fallen litter, weighed it, and soaked it. Instead of assuming shade or thirst, they asked a narrower question. Does the material coming off this tree, by itself, stop a seed from growing? It was careful, unglamorous work. Buckets, filter paper, trays of seed on a lab bench. And the numbers that came back would take the field years to accept, because what they found pointed at something the tree was manufacturing, not merely something it was taking. The strangest part comes later, but the first data already broke the simple story. Here is the answer that first report threatened to overturn. When you clear away every green thing under a tree, there are three ordinary suspects. Shade. The canopy simply steals the light. Water. The roots drink the soil dry before anything else can. And nutrients. A hungry tree strips the ground bare. Every one of these is real, and every one happens under a eucalyptus. So for years, skeptics had an easy dismissal. Of course, nothing grows there. They said, look how dense the shade is, look how the roots run. Why invent a chemical when thirst and darkness already explain it? There was even a proper word for the chemical idea, and it carried a whiff of pseudoscience. Allelopathy, one plant chemically suppressing another, had been named back in 1937 by the Austrian botanist Hans Molisch, and for decades it sat on the fringe. Too many early claims had collapsed once someone controlled for shade or competition. So the burden was brutal. To argue chemistry, you had to kill off shade, water, and nutrients as explanations first, and prove that something the tree released still stopped the seed cold. Most people assumed that could not be done cleanly. The eucalyptus, they figured, was just an ordinary bully, thirsty and tall. But there was one observation the bully theory could not swallow, and it was sitting right on the leaves. A eucalyptus does its worst work with the leaves it has already dropped. In the late 1960s, Del Moral and Muller soaked that fallen litter and watered ordinary seed with the runoff, and the seed barely sprouted, while the same seed in plain water came up fine. That was the fact the simple story could not survive. Not the shade, not the roots. The leaves themselves stopped the seed. The reason is the smell. A eucalyptus leaf is loaded with aromatic oils, terpenes, and one in particular called cineole, the same compounds that give the tree its sharp medicinal scent. When fog, dew, and rain wash over the fallen leaves and the shed bark, they carry those oils into the soil, where they coat waiting seeds and stall them before a root can form. Their results, published in 1970, put numbers on it. Seedling growth and germination fell sharply wherever the leaf oils reached and recovered when the oils were removed. The oils are volatile, too. On hot days they evaporate off the litter and the living leaves and drift down as vapor, so even bone-dry soil under the canopy gets dosed. It was, in plain terms, a slow chemical bombardment, refreshed with every dropped leaf and every warm afternoon. One careful study, though, is never enough, and critics were waiting to see if anyone else could repeat it. Repeating it was the real test, and it came. Through the 1970s and after, other researchers took eucalyptus litter into their own labs on other continents and hit the same wall. In Australia, the tree's home ground, ecologists found native seedlings suppressed by fresh eucalyptus leaves in controlled trays. In India, where eucalyptus was planted at huge scale for pulp and fuel wood, agricultural scientists measured how leaf extracts knocked down the germination of wheat and other crops sown nearby. A practical worry, not a curiosity, because farms sat right against the plantations. The genus is enormous. More than 700 species of eucalyptus, and the aromatic oil chemistry runs through most of them, which is why the effect kept surfacing wherever the trees were grown. Chemists went further, separating the leaf oils and testing them one at a time, and cineole and its relatives came up again and again as the seed stoppers. Newer instruments let them detect the compounds directly in the soil under groves, closing the last gap. The chemicals the tree makes were actually present, in the ground, exactly where the seeds were failing. The bare zone finally had a mechanism that survived every control anyone threw at it. And yet, the story is not quite as clean as one poisoning tree, because the soil itself gets a vote. A eucalyptus only wins its chemical war where the ground stays dry. Soak that same poisoned soil in a rainy climate, and the bare zone can vanish. So where does the chemistry go? The answer is that the oils do not last forever. Soil microbes eat them. In warm, wet ground, bacteria and fungi break the terpenes down within weeks, faster than the tree can refresh them, and seeds get a window to sprout. In dry heat, a Californian summer, an Australian drought, the microbes stall, the oils linger, and the poison accumulates instead of clearing. So the modern consensus is not that eucalyptus simply poisons everything. It is that the tree wages chemical warfare and the climate decides whether the weapon holds. That is why the field now talks about interference rather than a single cause. Shade, thirst, nutrient theft, and chemistry all stacked together, with the oils as the piece that pushes bare ground into truly bare. Ecologists have largely stopped arguing whether eucalyptus is allelopathic, the evidence is in the soil, and moved on to measuring how much each weapon contributes, tree by tree, climate by climate. For a plant that cannot move, it is a remarkably active strategy. Manufacture a chemical, load it into disposable leaves, and let the weather deliver the dose. Which leaves one uncomfortable question the tidy consensus still cannot fully answer. So the case is mostly closed, but not entirely. If a eucalyptus can manufacture a poison, load it into its leaves, and let the weather aim it at everything nearby, then the boundary between a tree standing still and a tree fighting starts to blur. And nobody can yet say how much of the world's quiet ground, the bare patches we walk past and never question, is the slow work of plants doing exactly the same thing, too patiently for us to ever notice.